At 3:07 in the morning, I stood in the dark kitchen, balancing a premature newborn in each arm. My husband rolled his suitcase downstairs, claiming he needed to find himself. He left behind a woman awake enough to trace every stolen dollar and forged signature. 11 weeks later, he returned tanned and smug, expecting a desperate wife. Instead, he found a quiet house and enough evidence to collapse his entire world in a single morning. My name is Everly Hayes. I am 36 years old, and I am standing in the center of a life that is rapidly tearing apart at the seams. We live in the quiet, manicured suburbs of Richmond, Virginia. It is the kind of neighborhood where lawns are aggressively green, driveways are swept clean, and crisis is supposed to happen strictly behind closed doors with the heavy curtains firmly drawn. Right now, I am barely clinging to the edge of my own sanity. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I gave birth to twins, Ivy and June. They came entirely too early. They are premature, impossibly tiny, fragile creatures with skin so thin you can see the frantic map of blue veins running just beneath the surface. I have not slept a full hour in 21 days. My body is a ruined, aching landscape. Every sudden movement pulls sharply at healing stitches. My lower back throbs with a dull, relentless pain. My breasts are hard, engorged, and leaking through thin cotton pads. My mind is entirely frayed, stretched so impossibly thin it hums like an overloaded power line, sparking with exhaustion and a desperate, animal need for rest. The midnight kitchen is a silent, fluorescent battlefield. The stark overhead light buzzes with a low, maddening frequency that drills into my temples. The granite counter is a chaotic graveyard of unwashed plastic bottles, silicone nipples, and breast pump parts waiting to be sterilized. Next to the stainless steel sink, a past-due electric bill sits pinned under a crusty, milk-stained burp cloth. The bottle warmer sitting on the kitchen island blinks a steady, mocking red light in the dimness. The air in the room is thick and suffocating. It smells strongly of sour formula, the metallic tang of postpartum bleeding, and the sharp, distinct scent of newborn sweat. Ivy is screaming from the medical-grade bassinet pushed against the dining table. June is screaming against my collarbone, her tiny red fists grabbing weakly at my damp shirt. It is a dual siren, a relentless, high-pitched drill boring straight into my skull, demanding things I barely have the energy to give. My husband, Julian Hayes, stands in the hallway just outside the kitchen archway. He is 39 years old. He is a regional manager at Crown Meridian Finance, a man who dictates his professional and personal life by spreadsheets, profit margins, and risk assessments. He is wearing his soft gray cashmere sweater and perfectly tailored lounge pants. He looks well-rested. He looks entirely out of place in this stifling room of spilled milk and misery. He is not looking at me. He is not looking at his screaming premature daughters. He has both of his hands pressed flat against his ears, his knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. "I cannot take this sound anymore," he says. His voice is completely flat. It is entirely cold. It is completely devoid of the frantic panic that has been choking my throat for 3 solid weeks. I stare at him through the thick haze of exhaustion. My brain is too sluggish to process the tone of his voice. I think it is just a joke, a cruel, sleep-deprived snap. We are both just incredibly tired. I try to tell myself, the newborn phase is a crucible. People say things they do not mean at 3 in the morning, but then I hear the sound. It cuts sharply through the noise of the baby's crying. It is the heavy metallic rasp of a heavy-duty zipper. I turn my head, my neck stiff and aching from rocking in the chair all night. Julian is pulling his expensive charcoal leather duffel bag from the hall closet. He drops it onto the hardwood floor. It lands with a heavy, final thud that vibrates through the soles of my bare feet. I watch, absolutely paralyzed, as he turns and walks purposefully into our master bedroom. I follow him slowly, dragging June heavily on my hip, her cries vibrating painfully against my ribs, while Ivy continues to wail uncontrollably from the kitchen bassinet. He is opening his dresser drawers. He is pulling out neatly folded dress shirts, his premium denim jeans, his expensive athletic underwear. He moves to the wooden nightstand. He grabs his dark blue passport. He slides his silver laptop into its black padded sleeve. He picks up the gold-rimmed sunglasses he bought on our anniversary trip to Italy. He grabs the white braided charger cable and loops it perfectly around his hand before tossing it in. He packs with a chilling, terrifying efficiency. There is no frantic tossing of garments. There is no hesitation. No stopping to look at a framed wedding photo on the dresser. No pacing the room in moral conflict. Every single item has a predetermined, designated place in the leather bag. The realization hits me like a physical blow to the stomach, knocking the wind out of my lungs. This is not a sudden, emotionally overwhelmed break. This is an execution. This is a meticulously prepared plan playing out right in front of my eyes. "What are you doing?" I ask. My voice cracks. It does not sound like my own voice. It sounds thin and reedy, like a frightened, cornered animal begging for a trap to open. He zips the heavy leather bag shut. He swings the thick woven strap over his broad shoulder. The expensive leather creaks under the weight. He turns and looks directly at me. His eyes sweep coldly over my milk-stained, oversized shirt, my tangled, unwashed hair, the screaming infant clawing at my chest. His expression does not change. He does not flinch. There is no pity, no regret, no trace of love left in his gaze. "Text me when this house is normal again," he says. He turns his back to me without waiting for a response. He walks down the hallway toward the front door. Near the entryway, he steps right over a puddle of spit-up formula on the oak floorboards. He lifts his polished leather shoe just high enough to avoid touching the mess, stepping over it as if it is a puddle of toxic acid, as if it is a minor, disgusting inconvenience that has absolutely nothing to do with him or his life. The heavy oak front door pulls open, letting in a sudden rush of cool night air, and then it clicks shut. The heavy deadbolt does not engage. It is just a soft, dismissing click of the latch. I stand firmly rooted to the floor. Through the tall, narrow window next to the door, I watch the bright red taillights of his luxury sedan flare to life. The powerful engine purrs smoothly, shifts into gear, and fades slowly down the dark suburban street, quickly swallowed by the shadows of the large oak trees. The silence left in the wake of the engine is instantly shattered by Ivy and June. Their tiny throats are raw. Their cries are desperate, scraping the heavy, stale air of the house. I stand perfectly still in the empty hallway. My entire life, the solid foundation of my reality, has just snapped cleanly in half. The marriage, the partnership, the shared future. It all broke and vanished in under 5 minutes. A cold, heavy dread begins to pool deep in the pit of my stomach. It is not just the shock of abandonment. It is a primal, urgent instinct warning me of immediate danger. Still holding the thrashing weight of June, I walk back into the blinding light of the kitchen. I reach over the messy counter and pick up my smartphone with my free, trembling hand. The glowing screen cracks my tired eyes with its stark brightness. I tap the icon for our shared banking app. The facial recognition software scans my exhausted face and unlocks the digital vault. The little blue loading circle spins for a second that feels like an eternity. The screen populates. I stare blankly at the numbers. I blink hard, thinking my severely sleep-deprived eyes are blurring the decimal points. I rub my eyes with my knuckles and look again. Joint checking, joint savings. The balances staring back at me are absurdly, terrifyingly low. They are mere fractions of what should absolutely be there. Where there should be tens of thousands of dollars saved specifically for my unpaid maternity leave and emergency medical funds, there are only double digits, $52.14 in checking, a few hundred in savings. A wave of vertigo hits me so hard I have to lean my hip heavily against the cold granite counter just to keep my shaky legs from giving out completely. The money is gone. My breath catches sharply in my throat. Suddenly, the charcoal duffel bag makes perfect, terrifying sense. The dark blue passport makes perfect sense. The calm, unbothered way he stepped over the mess on the floor makes perfect sense. His abrupt, callous departure was not a mental breakdown. It was not a man overwhelmed by the cries of his premature daughters. The empty bank accounts prove it with numerical certainty. The departure was just the visible tip of a massive, submerged blade that he had been sharpening in the dark for a very long time. The babies are still screaming. Their tiny lungs demand immediate attention. Their hunger and deep discomfort are the only real, tangible things left in this massive, empty house. I place the phone face down on the cold granite counter. I walk over to the bassinet. I bend down, entirely ignoring the sharp, tearing pull of my surgical stitches, and scoop Ivy up with my other arm. I stand up straight and hold them both tightly against my chest. Their tiny, frantic, bird-like heartbeats flutter wildly against my bare skin. They smell intensely of sour milk and pure, helpless desperation. I close my eyes tightly against the harsh fluorescent light. I do not scream at the ceiling. I do not throw ceramic plates against the wall. I do not swear loud. Dramatic revenge to the empty kitchen. There is no space for theatrics here. Instead, there is only a sudden, icy clarity setting deep into the marrow of my bones. Standing there in the middle of the mess, feeling the fragile, shifting weight of the only two things in the world that truly matter, I realize the absolute truth of my new reality. From this exact second forward, looking at the dark window and the unpaid bills, I know I no longer have the right to collapse. Sunlight lost its meaning. Days and nights bled into a singular suffocating loop of survival. My existence narrowed down to biological imperatives and mechanical repetition. Measure the powdered formula, warm the distilled water, feed one tiny mouth, pat a fragile back until a burp echoed softly in the quiet room. Change a soiled diaper, wipe my own tears with the back of a trembling hand. Soothe a crying infant to sleep. Start the exact same sequence over again before the sky outside the window even had a chance to turn gray. Time was no longer measured in hours or minutes. It was measured in ounces consumed in the brief, fleeting moments of silence between the wails. The real world crashed into my isolated bubble on a humid Tuesday afternoon. We ran out of the specialized premature infant formula. I strapped both babies into their heavy dual carrier and dragged us to the local pharmacy. Under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of aisle 4, the true weight of my situation materialized. I stood staring at the metal shelves, holding a plastic canister of the prescribed powder. The price tag read $38.99. I did the math in my head. They went through a canister every 3 days. June started to cry. It was not a fuss. It was a piercing, full-lung shriek that drew the judgmental stares of a woman buying greeting cards nearby. My chest tightened. I hurried to the checkout register, bouncing the heavy carrier against my thigh to soothe her. The teenage cashier scanned the canister. "That will be $41.14 with tax," he mumbled, barely looking up. I swiped the joint debit card. The card reader beeped an angry flat tone. A red message flashed on the tiny digital screen. Declined. My stomach plummeted. A hot flush of deep, prickling shame crept up the back of my neck. I forced a tight smile. "Let me try it again. The chip is acting up." I rubbed the gold square on my jeans and inserted it. The machine thought for a second. Beep. Declined. June's crying escalated, turning purple in the face. The line behind me was growing. The cashier stared at me with empty, polite impatience. The joint account, the one where my own paychecks had been deposited for 4 years, was completely hollowed out. I had to abandon the formula on the black conveyor belt, mumble a humiliated apology, and carry 2 screaming infants out into the suffocating heat of the parking lot without the one thing they needed to survive. When I managed to drag the carrier up my front steps, my neighbor was waiting on the porch, Margot Bell. She is 61 years old, a widow who keeps her hedges immaculately trimmed and her opinions mostly to herself. More importantly, she spent 30 years as a neonatal intensive care unit nurse before retiring. Margot did not offer a pitying smile. She did not peek into the carrier and coo. She was holding a large glass container of hot chicken and wild rice soup. Her sharp, observant eyes took in my flushed face, the heavy carrier, and the glaring absence of a second car in the driveway. She took one look at me and knew immediately that he was gone. She did not ask what had happened. She did not ask where my husband was. "Have you eaten a single thing today?" Margot asked. Her voice was gravelly and firm. I shook my head, unable to speak around the massive lump of unshed tears in my throat. "Open the door," she instructed. Margot became an unexpected silent anchor in a house adrift. She possessed a pair of steady, experienced hands that knew exactly how to support the floppy neck of a premature baby. She moved around my kitchen with quiet purpose, washing the plastic bottles I had neglected, forcing me to sit at the table and eat the soup while it was still steaming. There was no intrusive snooping, just the practical application of care. 2 days later, the fragile illusion of maintaining a normal routine shattered completely during a scheduled pediatric checkup. The clinic waiting room was full of cheerful, well-rested parents. I sat rigid in a plastic chair, balancing the double stroller, waiting for Ivy and June to be called back for their weight check. The receptionist, a young woman with bright pink fingernails, called my name and gestured me toward the front desk. "Mrs. Hayes, it looks like there is a problem with the girls' coverage," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential, sympathetic whisper. "The system is showing their insurance policy as inactive." The fluorescent lights above me seemed to flicker and dim. The air left my lungs. "That has to be a clerical mistake," I stammered, gripping the edge of the laminate counter. "My husband's company policy covers the entire family. They were just added to it 3 weeks ago." She tapped her keyboard, her pink nails clicking loudly in the quiet lobby. "I am sorry. It says the dependent coverage was officially terminated. You might want to have your husband call his human resources department to sort it out. Today's visit will be $250 out of pocket. Would you like to use a credit card?" I did not have $250. I did not have an active credit card. I had a wallet full of useless plastic tied to drained accounts. The humiliation was acidic, burning the back of my throat. It was a cold, terrifying anger that froze the blood in my veins. I had to reschedule the vital medical appointment, citing a sudden family emergency, and walk my fragile daughters back out to the car. Through all of this agonizing reality, his silence was an oppressive, physical weight in the house. There were 0 incoming phone calls. There were 0 text messages offering a hollow apology. There were 0 electronic money transfers to keep the lights on or buy diapers. There was only his heavy, suffocating absence, leaving a void that was rapidly filling with past due notices and mounting panic. That night, the sheer gravity of my situation finally pulled me to the floor. The house was pitch black except for the small amber nightlight plugged into the wall. I sat on the cold hardwood floor of the kitchen. Ivy was asleep, draped limply across my lap. June was resting heavily against my right shoulder, her soft breaths warming my collarbone. I leaned the back of my head against the lower cabinets, and for the first time since the front door clicked shut, I allowed myself to truly cry. The tears were silent, violent tremors that shook my shoulders. I was not crying because I missed the man I married. I was not mourning a lost romance. I was weeping because the sheer, terrifying magnitude of his betrayal was finally taking shape. He had not just walked out to escape the stress of crying infants. He had intentionally led me into a meticulously constructed trap. He had severed the safety net, locked the gates, and left me completely destitute with 2 lives entirely dependent on my empty hands. Margot found me there the next morning. She had let herself in with the spare key I gave her to drop off another meal. She saw the red rings around my eyes, the defeated slump of my spine as I poured tap water into the coffee maker. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me for a long moment before she spoke. "Heartbreak is incredibly loud," Margot said, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. "But dead is the thing that actually buries you in the ground." That single sentence struck the center of my chest like a perfectly aimed hammer. It drove the spike of reality straight into my brain. The fog of self-pity and confusion instantly evaporated. Margot was absolutely right. Tears would not purchase formula. Mourning a dead marriage would not turn the health insurance back on. Standing in the kitchen, listening to the coffee drip into the glass pot, something inside me permanently hardened. It was the crucial turning point. I stopped looking at my phone, waiting to see if he would ever come back. I stopped wondering what went wrong in his heart. Instead, I looked at the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. I wiped my face with a cold, damp paper towel. I finally started thinking about exactly what he took, and more importantly, how I was going to track every single penny of it down. I waited until the house was entirely silent, save for the rapid, fragile breathing of the girls. I sat at the dining room table, flipped open my silver laptop, and dialed Naomi Cross. Naomi and I had shared a suffocatingly small dorm room during our freshman year of college. Today, she is a highly sought-after freelance forensic accountant. She is a woman who firmly believes that human beings will lie directly to your face, but a well-kept balance sheet will always scream the absolute truth. I did not waste time with pleasantries or tearful explanations. I gave her my login credentials for every financial institution I could pull from my memory. I sat in the dim light, listening to the rapid, aggressive clicking of her mechanical keyboard vibrating through the phone speaker. "It did not happen all at once," Naomi said, her tone completely devoid of any soft sympathy. "People think thieves take the whole pie in one giant slice. Amateurs do that. He was incredibly methodical." She initiated a secure screen share. Rows of stark black and red text filled my monitor. She highlighted a long descending series of transactions. "Look at these withdrawals," she instructed. "They started exactly 3 weeks before you went into labor." He was bleeding the accounts dry drop by literal drop. "Daily maximums at automated teller machines. Small electronic transfers disguised as bill payments to vendors that do not actually exist in any corporate registry." My exhausted eyes scanned the screen, trying to make sense of the digital carnage playing out in front of me. The entire emergency savings fund, a crucial safety net we had spent 5 solid years carefully building, was completely eradicated. "Where did the bulk of the savings go?" I asked, my voice barely a raspy whisper. Naomi highlighted a massive wire transfer. "It went to a newly formed limited liability company, Northlight Renewal. I pulled the corporate filings from the state database. It is a completely hollow shell company. Everly. And he opened it exactly 2 months before the twins were born. He was quietly digging his escape tunnel while you were picking out paint colors for the nursery." The brutal revelations did not stop there. Naomi's fingers flew across her keyboard, hunting down credit inquiries and deep background financial footprints. "He also pulled a massive unsecured personal loan," she continued, her voice sharp with professional outrage. "It is solely in his name, which is why you never saw the paperwork. However, he used your joint home address to establish physical residency. Worse, he grossly inflated his personal salary by claiming your combined household income as his own to secure a rapid automated approval. He weaponized the financial stability you helped build to secretly fund his exit." Then came the final destination. I watched, my stomach twisting into tight knots, as Naomi cracked into a secondary credit card statement. It was an account he had hidden entirely by routing the electronic statements to a separate, private email address. The listed charges were staggering and deeply offensive. A luxury wellness resort located in the high desert of Santa Fe, a premium rental agreement for a convertible sports car, a hefty security deposit for a high-end, short-term vacation rental property boasting mountain views. The narrative he had sold me, the pitiful image of a broken, overwhelmed man fleeing a stressful environment to simply catch his breath, shattered into a million jagged pieces. He was not experiencing a mental breakdown. He was actively financing a lavish, sun-drenched escape. "Listen to me very carefully," Naomi commanded, her voice cutting through the thick fog of my shock. "This is no longer a sad story about a cold marriage. This is not about a husband who got scared of fatherhood. This is highly calculated financial sabotage. You are in a foot race right now. If you are slow to act, If you sit around waiting for him to come to his senses, the legal paperwork will solidify a narrative that works entirely in his favor. He will paint himself as a single income provider drowning in sudden medical debt, and he will use the very money he stole from you to hire a lawyer to prove it. Her harsh words were the exact catalyst I desperately needed. The paralyzing fear instantly mutated into a cold, hyper-focused drive. While still on the phone with Naomi, I opened a new browser window. I navigated to an entirely different banking institution. I opened a brand new checking account, strictly under my name, using my personal cell phone number and a newly created, highly secure email address. I became a relentless digital hoarder. I saved every single unpaid utility bill into a secure folder. I cataloged every grocery receipt for formula. I took digital screenshots of his luxury resort charges. I printed out the incorporation documents for Northlight renewal. I was gathering solid bricks to painstakingly rebuild the walls of a house he had deliberately burned to the absolute ground. But rebuilding required immediate capital, and my new solo account sat at exactly $0. Desperation clawed sharply at my throat. I left the dining room and walked into our shared home office. The room felt distinctly foreign, stripped of his personal items but heavily burdened by his remaining clutter. I dropped to my knees on the carpet in front of the heavy gray metal filing cabinet. I ripped open the bottom drawer, frantically searching through old tax returns and expired appliance warranties. I was hunting for a very specific thick manila envelope from Halcyon Risk Solutions. Halcyon Risk Solutions was my employer. I worked there as a contract reconciliation specialist, a job that required an obsessive eye for detail. I was currently on an approved, fully paid maternity leave. I finally found the envelope shoved far into the dark back corner of the metal drawer. I tore the heavy paper flap open. Inside was the official human resources documentation detailing my maternity leave benefits. I ran my trembling index finger down the dense columns of text until I found the payment schedule. A substantial lump sum of my earned salary was supposed to be directly deposited into our primary joint checking account exactly 14 days after the girls were born. I stared at the bolded date on the crisp corporate letterhead. 14 days after the birth. That date had already passed by a full week. I pulled my phone from my pocket and logged back into the hollowed-out joint banking application. I scrolled blindly through the meager transaction history one more time, praying my tired eyes had simply missed it. The large deposit from Halcyon Risk Solutions was not there. It had never arrived. A profound, bone-chilling cold washed over my entire body. I looked closer at the final page of the human resources packet, the specific page confirming direct deposit authorization. The 9-digit routing number listed there did not match our joint checking account. It matched the exact routing number Naomi had just traced to Northlight Renewal. I dropped the printed papers onto the floor. Julian had not simply walked out the front door with his own bags. He had quietly, systematically logged into my secure employee portal while I was heavily pregnant and exhausted. He had actively changed the direct deposit destination. He had hijacked my own earned income before it ever hit our bank. He did not just abandon his family. He deliberately reached directly into the crib and stole the very money meant to keep his newborn daughters alive. The initial, blinding shock finally burned itself out, leaving behind a vast, scorched earth inside my mind. But beneath that heavy layer of emotional ash, something old, sharp, and highly trained began to stir. Before I was a terrified mother of premature twins, before I was a wife left standing in a puddle of spilled milk, I was a contract reconciliation specialist. At Halcyon Risk Solutions, my entire professional reputation was built on hunting down discrepancies in multi-million-dollar corporate agreements. I tracked phantom physical assets, untangled intentionally complex ledger entries, and forced reluctant numbers to confess their hidden truths. I knew exactly how desperate people tried to hide their tracks. My professional instincts, buried under weeks of severe sleep deprivation and visceral trauma, suddenly snapped wide awake. This was no longer just a failing, tragic marriage. It was a hostile corporate takeover of my entire life, and I knew exactly how to conduct a relentless forensic audit. I desperately needed a clean, untraceable stream of revenue. I needed capital that he could not monitor, routed directly to the new secure banking account I had established in secret. I sat down at my laptop and drafted a carefully worded, emotionally detached email to my former supervisor, Graham Porter. Graham was a deeply pragmatic man who valued loyalty, precision, and uninterrupted workflow. I did not provide him with a tragic sob story about my ruined household. I simply stated that I had experienced a temporary shift in my family circumstances and now possessed the bandwidth to take on a few low-tier remote file audits during my maternity leave. 4 hours later, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. Graham offered me up to 20 hours a week of remote contract review. The hourly rate was a fraction of my standard salary, but it was absolutely legitimate, untainted income generated strictly by my own two hands. The moment we agreed on the terms, the suffocating grip around my throat loosened just a fraction. It was the very first solid brick laid in my new foundation. When the sun finally went down and the girls slipped into a fragile, restless sleep, my dining room table transformed into a strategic command center. I purchased a thick, black, hardcover notebook. It quickly became the official, unforgiving ledger of our daily survival. Every single night, I recorded the exact time of every single feeding. I logged the precise number of ounces consumed by both Ivy and June. I documented their fluctuating body temperatures, the strict frequency of their medication, the exact dollar amount of a jumbo pack of diapers, and every single cent spent on simply keeping them breathing. Furthermore, I noted every incoming utility bill, every unanswered text message sent to my absent husband, and every ignored phone call. I treated my daughter's vulnerable existence with the same rigorous, uncompromising documentation I once applied to high-stakes corporate mergers. My neighbor, Margot, noticed the distinct shift in my posture. She stopped bringing over heavy casseroles and started teaching me the harsh, practical mechanics of endurance. One afternoon, she watched me staring blankly at a massive, intimidating mountain of laundry, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of tasks required to keep the house running. Margot walked over, placed a firm hand on my shoulder, and told me to stop looking at the absolute peak of the mountain. She taught me how to slice the overwhelming day into tiny, survivable fractions. 20 minutes of pure, uninterrupted rest while the babies slept, forbidding myself from looking at a screen. 10 minutes dedicated solely to sterilizing plastic bottles and wiping down the sticky kitchen counters. 5 unbroken minutes just to stand alone on the back wooden porch, breathe in the humid Virginia air, and remind myself that my lungs were still functioning. It was a complete psychological revelation. I stopped trying to miraculously win the entire day and simply focused all my energy on conquering the next 20 minutes. This microscopic level of control inevitably began to bleed into my physical appearance. There was no cinematic, glamorous makeover. There was no dramatic haircut or sudden application of bright red lipstick to signal a rebirth. The changes were deeply functional and rooted in basic human dignity. I stopped letting my unwashed hair hang loose and started pulling it back into a tight, neat braid that stayed entirely out of my way. I threw the sour, milk-stained, oversized maternity shirts into the bottom of the hamper and started wearing clean, simple cotton tops. One morning, I poured myself a mug of black coffee and actually drank the entire thing while it was still hot enough to burn the roof of my mouth. I looked at my reflection in the bright bathroom mirror and saw a woman who knew exactly what her first 3 crucial tasks of the day were. I was no longer a weeping victim waiting to be rescued. I was a focused project manager actively stabilizing a critical crisis. My smartphone became my most vital investigative tool. I started walking through the quiet rooms of the house, capturing high-resolution images of our reality. I photographed the sterile medical bassinet, the tightly stacked boxes of specialized premature infant formula, the neat rows of tiny amber prescription bottles. I took pictures of the threatening, past-due utility notices before I promptly paid them with my new, hard-earned freelance money. I snapped photos of the pediatrician's schedules, the detailed weight gain charts, and the empty spaces in the closet where his clothes used to hang. This was not the erratic, obsessive behavior of a scorned woman unable to let go. I understood a fundamental truth from my grueling years at Halcyon Risk Solutions. Human memory is highly subjective, easily confused, and frequently manipulated in a courtroom setting. But a time-stamped digital photograph is an immovable, undeniable fact. Evidence is the only witness that never changes its testimony, regardless of the pressure applied. Then, the digital postcards from his new, liberated life began to surface. I had created a silent, anonymous account specifically to monitor his public social media profile without leaving a digital footprint. His updates were a masterclass in fabricated serenity. I saw a photograph of a steaming cup of expensive herbal tea overlooking a hazy purple mountain range at sunrise. He posted a long philosophical quote about the absolute necessity of prioritizing one's own healing journey and cutting away toxic energy. There was a carefully framed shot of a crystal-clear beach, featuring a perfectly chilled glass of white wine resting elegantly on a wooden balcony railing. Weeks ago, seeing those images would have triggered a catastrophic emotional collapse. I would have dropped to my knees. But this time, my pulse did not even elevate. I did not shed a single tear of betrayal. I simply stared at the contrast between his chilled wine glass and my sterile plastic baby bottles. I calmly pressed the buttons on the side of my phone, captured the crisp screenshot, and seamlessly transferred the image into a newly created, heavily encrypted desktop folder explicitly labeled for court. Naomi, true to her relentless and highly connected nature, facilitated the next crucial step. She introduced me to a family law attorney named Elena Ward. Elena was not the type of lawyer who offered warm smiles, tissues, or comforting platitudes about karma. She was a woman of incredibly few words, possessing a sharp, unblinking gaze that felt like it could strip the paint right off a brick wall. During our initial virtual consultation, I laid out the precise financial timeline Naomi had uncovered, the deliberately diverted maternity funds, and the growing gallery of serene, sun-drenched vacation photos. Elena listened in absolute, heavy silence. The only sound in the room was her heavy fountain pen occasionally scratching across a yellow legal pad. When I finally finished presenting the data, she did not offer a sigh of sympathy. She leaned forward, looking directly into the small camera lens of her laptop. "He is not out there finding himself," Elena stated, her voice dry, clinical, and completely devoid of any emotion. "He is actively building an alibi." That single sentence anchored me completely to the floor. It validated every cold, calculating instinct I had meticulously developed over the past few harrowing weeks. The scene in my kitchen that evening was profoundly different from the terrible night he walked out the door. The granite counters were scrubbed completely clean. The frantic, overwhelming mess of survival had been replaced by the quiet order of preparation. I sat straight-backed at the center of the wooden table. The thick black notebook lay open, filled with meticulously neat columns of daily data. My silver laptop glowed softly in the dim room, securely connected to the remote financial servers at Halcyon. The bottle warmer hummed a steady, quiet, reassuring rhythm in the background. I was physically exhausted, carrying a fatigue so deep it ached directly in my marrow. But as I looked at the highly organized surface in front of me, I realized something incredibly powerful. I was an utterly drained mother, running on fractions of sleep, but I was absolutely no longer lost. Elena Ward operates with the surgical precision of a butcher breaking down a carcass. During our next secure video conference, she demanded a granular, line-by-line review of the severed medical benefits. She subpoenaed the digital access logs directly from the corporate healthcare provider. The truth waiting at the bottom of that digital pile was a completely different species of cruelty. Julian had not simply forgotten to pay a monthly premium in the chaos of the birth. Exactly 48 hours after I delivered the girls, he had actively logged into the employee benefits portal and executed a qualifying life event change. He deliberately downgraded his comprehensive family coverage to an employee-only tier. He intentionally stripped his premature daughters of their medical safety net while they were still breathing conditioned air inside the neonatal intensive care unit. But Elena found the real knife buried deep in the system metadata. The electronic signature authorizing the catastrophic downgrade was stamped with my full legal name. The digital timestamp attached to that specific forgery read 2:14 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I stared at the screen, a cold sweat breaking out across my collarbones. At 2:14 on that specific Thursday, I was heavily medicated on intravenous painkillers, drifting in and out of consciousness in a sterile hospital bed while nurses constantly monitored my fluctuating blood pressure. The hits came in rapid, sickening succession, each one a precise, calculated cut. Naomi had continued digging into the diverted corporate maternity funds. She tracked the internal payroll modification form right back to its original source. It was not submitted through my highly secure employee portal, as we had initially suspected. Instead, the authorization was emailed to the Human Resources Department using a secondary, generic household email address we used primarily for streaming service subscriptions and retail junk mail. Julian possessed the password. He had impersonated me digitally, routing my earned salary to his hidden shell company with a few casual keystrokes. Then Elena delivered the heaviest blow of the afternoon. She had managed to secure a preliminary copy of the application he submitted for his massive unsecured personal loan. Under the mandatory section detailing marital status and household dynamics, Julian had checked a specific box and added a typewritten addendum. He legally declared, under penalty of perjury, that we had entered into a mutually agreed-upon temporary separation. He filed that binding document a full 9 days before he actually packed his charcoal leather duffel bag. He was systematically weaving a dense, protective legal cocoon around his theft, turning the vicious gutting of our family into a documented, allegedly consensual financial split. Sitting in the quiet hum of my living room, the sheer magnitude of his deception finally locked into place. The money was just numbers on an illuminated screen. The crippling debt was merely a complex mathematical problem to solve. What truly paralyzed me, what made the hairs on my arms stand up and my stomach physically revolt, was the chilling sociopathic calmness of his exit strategy. While I was bleeding, weeping, and begging the universe to keep our tiny daughters alive, the man I married was quietly walking through the house, meticulously locking every single door, sealing every window, and pouring gasoline on the floorboards before stepping out to strike the match. He did not lose his mind. He did not break under the immense pressure of newborn care. He executed a flawless, premeditated corporate liquidation of my entire life. I was still trying to swallow the jagged edges of that reality when my phone buzzed violently on the coffee table. The screen lit up with his name. It was the very first direct communication from him in almost a month. My heart slammed against my ribs. A sudden, violent thumping that made me incredibly lightheaded. I braced myself for a demand, a legal threat, or perhaps a sudden, crushing wave of fabricated remorse. I swiped the screen open. The text message read simply, "Send me a few good pictures of the girls looking healthy, so I can explain to my family and friends that everything is fine back home." I stared at the glowing letters until the black text blurred into meaningless shapes. There was absolutely no inquiry about their critical weight gain. There was no question about their fragile lung development. There was no mention of the unpaid electricity bill or the thousands of dollars in stolen maternity pay. He just wanted a prop. He desperately needed a digital shield to deflect the uncomfortable questions he was inevitably facing from his social circle. I felt a hard, sharp laugh scrape its way up my dry throat. I did not reply. I locked the screen and placed the device face down on the polished wood. But Julian did not need my active cooperation to construct his alternate reality. Late that evening, while aggressively scrubbing another batch of silicone nipples, I logged into my anonymous monitoring account. My blood turned to absolute ice. Julian had uploaded a new photograph to his public social media feed. It was not a picture of a scenic beach or a glass of expensive wine. It was an old, poorly lit photograph taken during our first terrifying week in the neonatal intensive care unit. It showed his large hand resting gently over the thick plastic of an incubator, the framing entirely cropping me out of the picture. The accompanying caption was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. It spoke eloquently of the grueling, unspoken trials of sudden single fatherhood. It detailed the agonizing, sleepless nights, and the heavy, crushing burden of navigating a horrific marital crisis while desperately trying to be a solid rock for his medically fragile children. It painted a vivid, agonizing portrait of a devoted, exhausted man bravely holding the crumbling pieces of his family together entirely on his own. The post went instantly viral within his extensive professional and personal networks. I scrolled through the comments, my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. There were hundreds of sympathetic messages praising his incredible strength and unwavering dedication. Colleagues from the finance firm offered their profound condolences for his incredibly difficult situation. Then I saw the specific detail that violently shifted the entire narrative from a pathetic personal lie to a blatant, actionable public fraud. A link to a digital crowdfunding platform was embedded right in the comment section, pinned to the top of the feed by Julian himself. The title of the campaign begged for financial assistance to help a struggling new father cover unexpected, catastrophic medical expenses and urgent legal fees during a painful separation. I watched the progress bar in real time. People were actually sending him money. Acquaintances, extended relatives, and complete strangers were transferring increments of $50, $100, and $500 directly into his pocket based on a spectacular, entirely fabricated tragedy. He was taking the very disaster he had intentionally engineered and monetizing it for public sympathy and pure profit. A profound, entirely new sensation washed over my entire body, completely erasing the last lingering traces of shock and fatigue. The defensive crouch I'd been forced into over the past several weeks instantly dissolved. I closed the laptop screen with a sharp, decisive snap. I did not feel the urge to cry, and I certainly did not feel the urge to panic. The plot had violently snapped in a brand new direction. He thought his pristine reputation was his impenetrable armor. He believed his curated online persona was completely bulletproof. Sitting there in the stark kitchen light, I finally saw the massive, glaring vulnerability in his grand design. I was no longer just going to quietly rebuild my own life and shield my daughters from the fallout. I was going to systematically dismantle his. I was going to take every single forged document, every stolen dollar, and every pathetic, lying photograph, and I was going to pull his entire mask down right in front of the exact audience he was currently begging for applause. Elena did not send a warning shot. She unleashed a silent, suffocating avalanche of paperwork. On a crisp Tuesday morning, she formally filed an aggressive petition for emergency, sole physical and legal custody of Ivy and June. Attached to that primary document was a demand for immediate temporary child and spousal support, calculated using his actual, heavily inflated executive salary rather than the fabricated numbers he had used to secure his secret personal loans. More importantly, she filed a sweeping motion for full financial discovery and a strict digital preservation order. This specific legal mandate locked down his ability to delete a single email, alter a single insurance document, hide a single shell company transaction, or scrub a single pitiful, lying post from his social media feeds without facing severe judicial sanctions for the deliberate destruction of evidence. Through all of this intense legal maneuvering, I maintained absolute, terrifying radio silence. I did not send him an angry text message demanding an explanation for the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign. I did not leave a sobbing, accusatory voicemail on his phone. I did not give him the slightest indication that the weather in my world had drastically changed. I let every single legal motion proceed entirely in the dark, adhering strictly to the letter of the law, hitting every single procedural deadline, and verifying every single typed word. The element of surprise was my absolute most valuable asset, and I guarded it ruthlessly. To fortify the emergency custody petition, we needed neutral, unimpeachable witnesses who could speak to the reality of my daily survival. Margot sat at my dining room table one evening, wearing her reading glasses, and drafted a devastatingly precise sworn affidavit. She did not use flowery, emotional language. She used the cold, clinical vocabulary of a veteran neonatal intensive care unit nurse. She meticulously documented the exact physical state she found me in, during those early, brutal days following his departure. She detailed my severe exhaustion, my physical post-surgical pain, and my unwavering, singular dedication to keeping two fragile, premature infants alive. Most damning of all, she stated clearly for the permanent legal record that in the hundreds of hours she had spent assisting inside our home, the father of the children was entirely, completely absent. Our pediatrician provided the next heavy stone for our legal catapult. The clinic administration handed over the complete, certified medical logs for both girls. The printed pages showed their frighteningly low birth weights, the strict frequency of their required checkups, and the steady, hard-won physical progress they were making under my sole care. Tucked right behind the clinical growth charts was a formal, signed statement from the head doctor. It officially confirmed that I was the only parent who ever walked through their glass doors. It also documented the exact date and time I was informed that our health insurance had been abruptly and maliciously terminated, and it provided the financial receipts proving I had paid for their essential medical care strictly out of my own desperately thin pocket. While the medical and eyewitness testimonies established my absolute fitness as a primary caregiver, Naomi constructed the weapon that would utterly obliterate his character. She presented me with a massive, color-coded digital spreadsheet. It was a brutal, side-by-side chronological comparison of our vastly different realities. The left column represented my grueling daily existence. It listed the exact cost of bulk diapers, the escalating electric bills, the heavy co-payments for the pediatrician, and the steep price of specialized premature infant formula. The right column represented his simultaneous, fabricated reality. It tracked the thousands of dollars spent at the high desert wellness retreat, the luxury rental car payments, the expensive dinners at upscale restaurants, and the cash withdrawals at premium resort automated teller machines. Naomi took the abstract, overwhelming feeling of deep injustice and distilled it into a series of undeniable, highly formatted mathematical rows. It was a financial autopsy that no amount of smooth corporate talking could ever explain away. Simultaneously, I actively expanded my professional footprint. I reached back out to Graham Porter and requested a significant increase in my remote auditing workload. I was now logging 20 to 25 hours a week, analyzing complex corporate risk portfolios while the twins slept in their dual bassinet beside my home office desk. The money was steady, perfectly clean, and entirely under my strict control, but more importantly, it deliberately shifted the fundamental narrative of my impending court case. I was no longer going to stand before a family court judge as a helpless, abandoned housewife begging for a financial rescue. The towering stack of paperwork would clearly show a highly capable, steadily employed professional who was actively and successfully rebuilding a stable, secure environment for her children through sheer grit and undeniable competence. Meanwhile, Julian's online performance art reached new, profoundly absurd heights. Secure in his arrogant belief that I was far too exhausted and mentally broken to fight back, he continued to post daily updates for his captive, sympathetic audience. There were more long, rambling paragraphs about the painful necessity of cutting ties with toxic environments to save one's own soul. There were profound, empty quotes about spiritual rebirth and finding true, authentic freedom after a period of intense, unspoken domestic suffering. Watching him digitally parade his fabricated trauma, I realized a deeply pathetic paradox about his entire strategy. The only possible way he could successfully play the role of the wounded, overwhelmed victim was by completely erasing the actual victims from the frame. He had to pretend that a bleeding, panicked wife and two screaming, medically vulnerable babies simply did not exist. His entire healing journey was built on the absolute, sociopathic denial of the lives he had deliberately endangered. During a late afternoon secure video conference, as we meticulously reviewed the final stack of compiled evidence, Elena looked up from the thick black binder resting on her mahogany desk. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and offered a rare, thin sliver of a smile. People like him, men who operate with this specific level of breathtaking arrogance, they do not collapse from one giant, theatrical blow, Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, fiercely serious register. They always think they can charm or negotiate their way out of a single mistake. No, they collapse because of 10 small, undeniable truths lined up in the exact right order. We have built a solid brick wall, Everly, and he is going to run his head straight into it at full speed. Her words settled deep into the center of my chest, completely replacing the last lingering shreds of postpartum anxiety with a profound, icy calm. 2 days later, the official notification arrived in my secure digital inbox. The family court had officially granted our request for an expedited, temporary hearing based on the alarming financial and medical evidence we had presented. I stared at the bolded date stamped on the digital document. It was exactly 1 week away. I closed the silver laptop and walked slowly into the living room. The house was peacefully quiet. The twins were resting heavily in their cribs. The laundry was neatly folded. The utility bills were paid in full with my own earned money. I stood by the large front window, looking out at the quiet, manicured suburban street, and let a cold, beautiful realization wash over my entire body. For the past 2 grueling months, I had been the one desperately reacting to his sudden, violent ambushes. I had been the one scrambling in the dark to survive the calculated explosions he set off in my life. But the dynamic had permanently, irreversibly shifted. The heavy steel trap was fully set. The legal jaws were locked wide open, and for the very first time since the horrible night he walked out that front door, Julian Hayes was the one who was about to be completely, utterly blindsided. The heavy brass lock on the front door clicked loudly at exactly 4:15 on a Friday afternoon. I was standing near the kitchen island, wiping down the immaculate granite surface with a microfiber cloth. I did not jump. My pulse did not suddenly race. The frantic, terrified woman who had wept on these exact hardwood floors weeks ago was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating architect standing inside a fortress of her own making. The heavy oak door swung open. Julian stepped over the threshold, pulling his expensive charcoal leather duffel bag behind him. The small, smooth wheels rolled effortlessly across the floorboards. He looked exceptionally healthy. His skin carried a deep, golden tan, the kind of expensive glow that only comes from days spent lounging beside high-desert resort pools. He was wearing a crisp, light blue linen shirt, the top 2 buttons casually undone, and perfectly tailored khaki trousers. He carried himself with the loose, relaxed posture of a man returning from a mildly inconvenient business trip, a man who fully believed he had simply stepped outside to catch his breath and was now ready to resume his rightful place on the throne of his household. He stopped dead in the middle of the entryway. He dropped the heavy leather strap of his bag. The smug, rehearsed expression on his face instantly faltered, replaced by a profound, visible confusion. He had clearly prepared himself to walk into a disaster zone. He expected to find overflowing trash cans, a sink piled high with rotting dishes, and a shattered, weeping wife desperate for his return and his financial salvation. Instead, he was staring at a living room that was flawlessly organized. The floors were swept clean. The dual medical bassinets were positioned perfectly near the large bay window, draped in fresh, bright white cotton blankets. The air did not smell of sour milk and panic. It smelled faintly of lavender cleaning solution and fresh coffee. His eyes drifted slowly to the large magnetic white board I had mounted on the kitchen wall. It was meticulously gridded out with black marker, detailing strict, rotating schedules for feeding, medication, and sleep cycles. Finally, his gaze landed on me. I was not wearing milk-stained sweatpants. I was wearing a sharply pressed, crisp white button-down shirt and fitted dark jeans. My hair was pulled back tightly, elegantly secured at the nape of my neck. I stood perfectly still, resting my hands lightly on the edge of the kitchen island, watching him with the detached, clinical interest of a scientist observing a deeply predictable specimen. My absolute, chilling calmness unsettled him far more than a screaming fit ever could have. He blinked rapidly, looking around the bright, quiet space as if he had accidentally unlocked the door to a completely different woman's life. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably from one polished loafer to the other. When he finally spoke, his very first question was a magnificent, defining revelation of his true character. He did not ask how much weight his premature daughters had gained. He did not ask if they were finally breathing without the aid of specialized medication. He did not even ask how I was recovering from major abdominal surgery. "Where is the money?" he asked, his voice sharp and accusatory. I knew exactly what he meant. He had noticed the recent, aggressive auto drafts I had set up using his inflated salary data through the temporary court order, or perhaps he simply realized I had not defaulted on the mortgage and was demanding to know how I survived his financial starvation tactics. With that single selfish demand, I knew with absolute certainty that he was entirely oblivious to the massive steel trap hovering just inches above his neck. "The money," I replied, my voice steady, perfectly modulated, and devoid of any emotional tremor, "was utilized to keep the lights on in this house. It paid for the specialized formula keeping your daughters alive. It covered the pediatric copayments you canceled when you illegally altered our insurance policy. It paid for a professional deep cleaning service exactly one time so I could scrub the hospital bacteria out of the nursery. It paid for every single thing required to keep two fragile human beings safe while their father was out healing himself in a sunny place." His jaw tightened. The golden tan could not hide the sudden, angry flush creeping up his neck. He immediately defaulted to his heavily rehearsed script, desperately trying to wrestle the narrative back into the familiar territory of his own victimhood. "You have absolutely no idea what I was going through," Julian snapped, stepping closer, pointing a rigid finger at his own chest. "I was completely burnt out. I was having severe panic attacks in the driveway every single night. I was suffocating under the pressure of the medical bills and the screaming. I needed space. I had to step away temporarily to protect my own mental health so I could be a better partner. You cannot punish me for having a human breaking point." Weeks ago, I would have desperately tried to understand him. I would have offered him an emotional cushion, blaming myself for not noticing his stress. But I no longer provided soft landings for cowards. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms. I simply looked him directly in his eyes and delivered a sentence that instantly froze the oxygen in the room. "When you get overwhelmed, you pack a bag, drain the bank accounts, and leave," I said smoothly. "When I get overwhelmed, I stay awake for 72 hours straight and keep my children alive. Do not ever stand in my kitchen and call it the same thing." The words struck him with physical force. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The rehearsed psychological jargon about boundaries and healing completely failed him. I had stripped away his carefully constructed excuse and exposed the raw, ugly cowardice underneath. Unable to win the verbal exchange, Julian abruptly turned away. He decided to physically reassert his dominance over the space. He walked past me, heading straight toward the master bedroom. I did not stop him. I simply turned around and watched his broad shoulders retreat down the hallway. A moment later, he stopped dead in the doorframe. The large, heavy oak dresser that used to hold his expensive watches and designer ties was completely empty. I had systematically removed every single trace of his existence from the primary living areas. "Where are my things?" he demanded, spinning around, a sharp edge of genuine panic finally bleeding into his tone. "In the secondary guest room at the end of the hall," I answered calmly, picking up my coffee mug. "Your seasonal clothing is boxed in the closet. Your personal paperwork and your corporate laptop have been secured in the filing cabinet. The key is resting on the nightstand." He marched down the hall and pushed open the door to the small guest room. I could see the rigid tension in his spine as he surveyed the neatly stacked cardboard boxes and the sterile, unwelcoming bed. He was fundamentally a man who demanded to be the center of gravity in any room he entered. Seeing his entire life marginalized, packed away, and relocated to the periphery of the house was a profound psychological blow. He realized, with a sudden, sinking dread, that he was no longer the default main character of this household. He was merely a guest, and a highly unwelcome one at that. He walked slowly back into the living room, his hands resting awkwardly on his hips. the arrogant, sun-kissed traveler who had confidently rolled his suitcase through the front door just 10 minutes earlier, was completely gone. In his place stood a deeply uncomfortable, highly agitated man, caught somewhere between blinding anger and crushing humiliation. He glared at me, his eyes narrowing as his mind frantically tried to calculate how to regain control of a woman who was no longer afraid of him. He thought this was the worst of it. He truly believed that a cold shoulder, a cleared-out bedroom, and a sharp tongue were the absolute maximum penalties he was going to face for his grand betrayal. He stood there, breathing heavily, entirely unaware that the impeccably organized paperwork locked away in my lawyer's briefcase was already stepping closer to him, marching steadily forward to completely dismantle his life. The digital forensic excavation had moved past the surface-level theft of our checking accounts and into the deep, subterranean layers of his financial treason. Naomi was no longer just reviewing monthly banking statements. She was pulling full credit dossiers and running abstract title searches on the physical property itself. Late on a Wednesday evening, while the girls slept soundly in the other room, my phone vibrated with an incoming secure file transfer from Naomi. The subject line was completely blank, but the urgency of her follow-up text message told me to open it immediately. I sat at the dining table, the screen illuminating my face in the dark room. It was a dense, 70-page digital application for a home equity line of credit. It was a massive loan leveraging the very walls and roof that sheltered my premature daughters. The application was currently sitting in a pending underwriting status, waiting for a final automated disbursement of $85,000. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never discussed borrowing against our home equity, yet, scrolling down to the final authorization page, there was my full legal name, rendered perfectly in a recognized electronic signature block. My breath caught sharply, but the panic was instantly replaced by a cold, surgical focus. I called Naomi. She did not even say hello when she picked up the line. "Look at page 42, Naomi instructed, her voice crackling with the electric thrill of a hunter cornering prey. "Look at the digital fingerprint attached to your signature. Every electronic document execution records an Internet protocol address and a device identifier. He did not forge this on your personal laptop. He did not use the tablet in your living room. The metadata points directly to a secure desktop terminal registered to the internal corporate network at Crown Meridian Finance." The implications bloomed rapidly in my mind. He had not just committed domestic financial abuse, he had utilized his corporate resources to execute a felony forgery. But Naomi was not finished pulling the thread. She directed me to the income verification section of the pending loan application. To qualify for a line of credit that large, especially after secretly draining our cash reserves to zero, Julian had to prove a massive, stable cash flow. "He uploaded an employment verification letter," Naomi continued, her tone dropping into a deadly serious register. "It is printed on official Crown Meridian letterhead. It states his base salary and his projected annual bonuses, completely omitting the fact that he was currently restructuring his life to hide assets." I ran the internal routing number on the bottom of the letterhead. It bypassed the official human resources queue entirely. He used his regional manager access credentials to generate a phantom income verification document for himself. I immediately forwarded the entire encrypted file to Elena. Her response was less than a paragraph, but it hit with the force of a legal sledgehammer. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Elena had drafted and successfully filed a sweeping emergency injunction with the commercial lender, instantly freezing the pending equity disbursement. But she did not stop at the bank. Armed with the digital proof that Julian had weaponized his corporate access, Elena drafted a formal preservation of evidence demand and sent it directly via certified mail to the Chief Compliance Officer and the Head of Human Resources at Crown Meridian Finance. The silent, invisible war he thought he was waging in the privacy of our home had just violently breached the perimeter of his career. While Elena was detonating charges in his professional life, a completely different type of explosive landed directly in my lap. I received a direct message on a social media platform from an old university acquaintance, someone I had not spoken to in over 5 years. The message contained a simple, hesitant apology and 5 attached image files. I clicked the first image. It was a screenshot of a private alumni network group. Julian had shared a link to the online fundraising campaign I had discovered earlier, but he was actively distributing it in wealthy, closed professional circles. The attached story was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. He described our marriage as a sudden, tragic casualty of severe mental illness, heavily implying that my postpartum state had made the home environment violently unstable and unsafe. He positioned himself as the sole, desperate guardian, trying to secure specialized legal representation to rescue his vulnerable children from a deteriorating situation. I reviewed the donation ledger captured in the screenshots. These were not anonymous strangers tossing spare change. These were executives, former classmates, and industry peers transferring significant sums: $200 from a fraternity brother, $500 from a regional director at a competing firm, $1,000 from a senior vice president. The individual amounts were varied, but the cumulative effect was devastating. He was no longer just a liar spinning a sad story to protect his ego. By actively soliciting and accepting monetary contributions based on a provably false narrative of domestic abuse and sole custody, he had crossed a bright, thick line into criminal theft by deception. He was committing wire fraud in broad daylight, using the manufactured suffering of his own family as his primary marketing material. The air in the house began to shift by Friday evening. The legal and corporate tripwires we had set were finally starting to snap. Julian emerged from the guest bedroom, his face drawn and slightly pale, lacking the arrogant, sun-tanned luster he had paraded just days before. He had likely received an uncomfortable phone call from his compliance department, or perhaps a sudden alert that his massive equity loan had been abruptly blocked. He walked into the kitchen. I was carefully measuring distilled water into a row of sterilized bottles. He stood near the doorway, awkwardly shifting his weight, trying to find an angle of approach that did not involve shouting. When he finally spoke, his voice was remarkably soft, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "Everly, we need to sit down and talk like adults," he said, holding his hands out in a gesture of fabricated surrender. "This is spiraling completely out of control. The lawyers are just going to drain whatever resources we have left. We are destroying each other. We need to handle this privately. Just the two of us, for the sake of the girls and their future." I slowly screwed the plastic cap onto the last bottle. I turned to face him, leaning my lower back against the cold granite counter. I studied his face, looking past the fake exhaustion and the practiced sincerity. I understood the psychology of men like Julian with terrifying clarity. They never beg for privacy when they are hurting you. They only suddenly discover the immense value of discretion when the blazing spotlight of truth threatens the only thing they genuinely worship. He did not care about the girls or their future. He did not care about our depleted resources. He cared absolutely and entirely about his reputation, and he could smell the smoke from the fires Elena and Naomi were lighting around his carefully constructed public image. "There is no privacy left to protect," I told him, my voice completely flat and unyielding. "You sold it for sympathy and a few $1,000s online. You signed my name on a loan document. You do not want to talk like an adult. You just want the consequences to stop." He stared at me, the muscles in his jaw ticking rapidly. He opened his mouth to deploy another carefully worded excuse, another attempt to manipulate me back into submission, but the absolute, cold certainty in my eyes silenced him. He turned on his heel and retreated back to his designated corner of the house, pulling the door shut behind him. Later that night, the house finally quieted down to the rhythmic, soft breathing of the twins. I sat in the dim light of the home office and connected a secure audio call to Elena. We reviewed the day's developments, confirming that the compliance department at his firm had officially acknowledged receipt of our preservation order. Before we disconnected the call, Elena's voice dropped into a low, quiet hum that sent a sharp, involuntary shiver directly down my spine. "Everly, you need to understand the full scope of what we have just documented," she whispered through the digital connection. The forged signature crossing state lines on an electronic loan application. The fraudulent corporate income verification. The active, documented solicitation of funds under completely false pretenses. If this unbroken chain of evidence holds up during the discovery phase, Julian is not just going to be sitting across from a family court judge, arguing about visitation schedules and child support. She paused, letting the profound weight of her words settle into the silent room. He is going to be sitting across from a federal prosecutor. It happened at exactly 4:30 on a muggy Monday afternoon. I was standing in the shadows of the living room, watching through the narrow gap in the heavy linen curtains. Julian was pacing the length of the concrete driveway, holding his smartphone tightly to his ear. He was projecting his authoritative, polished corporate voice, assuring whoever was on the other end of the line that the recent domestic turbulence was completely handled. He waved his free hand in the air, dismissing the destruction of our family as a minor, temporary logistical hiccup. Next door, Margot was standing on her front lawn, calmly holding a green garden hose, watering her blooming rhododendrons. A rusted silver sedan pulled up to our curb, the brakes squealing sharply in the quiet suburban air. A bored-looking man wearing a faded gray windbreaker stepped out of the vehicle. He held a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope. He walked straight up the driveway, completely ignoring Julian's raised index finger signaling for him to wait. "Julian Hayes?" the man asked, his voice cutting clearly through the humid air. Julian scowled, visibly deeply annoyed by the sudden interruption to his important phone call. He offered a curt, single nod. The man did not ask for a signature. He simply thrust the heavy envelope forward, slapping it firmly against the center of Julian's crisp white button-down shirt. The man turned around, walked back to his rusted car, and drove away. Julian stood perfectly still, the phone slipping slightly from his ear, staring down at the legal summons resting by his polished leather shoes. Margot did not look away. She simply adjusted the nozzle on her hose to a finer mist and kept watering her flowers. Panic is a highly potent motivator. Within 48 hours, Julian had authorized a massive retainer fee to hire one of the most aggressively slick, high-priced defense attorneys in the financial district. Elena Ward called me at 8:15 that evening to ruthlessly dissect their initial strategic filings. "They are not going to deny that he left the house," Elena explained, her voice entirely devoid of panic. "They are attempting a highly aggressive psychological rebrand. They are building a defense centered around a concept called vicarious postpartum burnout. They were going to argue that his sudden departure was not a malicious, calculated abandonment, but rather a medically necessary, temporary therapeutic separation. However, to make that specific, fabricated narrative hold any legal weight, they needed a dangerous environment to flee from. They needed a villain. Elena warned me that his legal team was actively preparing a dirty secondary counterattack. They were going to quietly insinuate to the judge that I was exhibiting severe, unpredictable signs of postpartum mental instability. Their goal was simple and incredibly vicious. They wanted to obscure his massive financial crimes by putting me entirely on the defensive, forcing me to waste all my energy proving my own sanity instead of prosecuting his theft. They severely underestimated the woman they were fighting. Elena had completely anticipated the smear campaign. She did not even wait for their motion to officially land on the judge's desk. Instead, she preemptively flooded the court docket with an impenetrable, towering wall of empirical evidence. She submitted my comprehensive postnatal medical evaluations, complete with sworn, notarized affidavits from my obstetrician confirming my absolute psychological stability and high cognitive function. She filed the rigorous, unbroken schedule of the twins' pediatric appointments, legally proving that I had flawlessly managed their complex, life-saving medical care without a single missed dose or forgotten checkup. She attached Margot's devastatingly precise eyewitness testimony. Most importantly, Elena submitted a certified, bound copy of my thick black hardcover notebook. My meticulous, handwritten daily logs documenting every single ounce of consumed formula, every slight fluctuation in body temperature, and every agonizingly calculated dollar spent became a legally binding monument to my extreme competence. The malicious narrative of an unstable, overwhelmed mother completely shattered against the cold, hard rock of my heavily documented reality. My mental stability was no longer up for debate. It was a mathematically proven fact. While Elena fortified the legal walls, Naomi delivered the ultimate weapon of total destruction. She sent over the completed master timeline. It was a staggering, breathtaking piece of forensic accounting artistry. She had perfectly synchronized every single one of his financial transactions with his serene social media posts, his luxury retreat itinerary, his internal corporate emails, and the exact time-stamped minute he fraudulently downgraded our health insurance policy. The timeline locked every single piece of data into an unforgiving grid. It completely eradicated any possible illusion of a sudden, impulsive mental breakdown. It painted a crystal-clear, terrifying portrait of a highly orchestrated, patiently executed financial assassination. There was absolutely no room left for his lies to breathe. The atmosphere inside the house on the night before the preliminary hearing was thick and suffocating. It felt like the heavy, highly ionized air that settles right before a massive, violent thunderstorm completely rips the sky apart. At 11 o'clock at night, I was standing in the dimly lit kitchen, pouring a glass of cold tap water. The house was dead quiet. Julian walked through the archway. The arrogant, untouchable swagger he usually carried was completely gone, replaced by a restless, highly nervous energy. He stopped a few feet away from the kitchen island. He lowered his voice to a soft, intimate whisper, desperately attempting to summon the old, familiar charm that he used to employ to resolve our minor marital disagreements. He looked down at the floor, then back up at me, and asked for a second chance. He talked smoothly about hitting the reset button, about attending intensive therapy together, about doing things right this time for the sake of our beautiful daughters. I did not blink. My expression remained entirely blank. When he realized the soft approach was completely failing, his tone shifted violently. The pathetic begging morphed instantly into a cold, desperate threat. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into tight slits, his jaw muscles clenching. He warned me that if I pushed this aggressive legal battle too far, if I actively tried to destroy his lucrative career and publicly humiliate him, nobody would win. He claimed the lawyers would drain every single cent we had, and we would both end up completely broke and miserable. He was trying to use mutually assured destruction as a final bargaining chip. For the very first time since the day we met, I looked at his face and did not see the man I had married. The grand illusion was permanently dead. I did not see a powerful regional manager or a charming, sophisticated partner. I only saw a deeply panicked, remarkably small man who was realizing, with absolute creeping horror, that his corporate salary, his practice charisma, and his fake pity could no longer buy his way out of a consequence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I set the heavy glass down on the granite counter. The soft clink echoed loudly in the quiet room. "You are completely mistaken," I told him, my voice perfectly level, carrying the heavy, absolute weight of an anvil. "This is not a game to see who wins. This is simply the moment your bill comes due." I walked past him, leaving him standing entirely alone in the dark kitchen. The climax of the premonition arrived the next morning. The sun rose brightly over the quiet suburban street, casting long, sharp shadows across the driveway. Through the front window, I watched Julian step out the front door. He was wearing his most expensive, perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He adjusted his silk tie, smoothed back his hair, and slid confidently into the driver's seat of his luxury sedan. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror and offered himself a tight, reassuring nod. As the powerful engine purred to life and he drove smoothly toward the downtown courthouse, I realized the most pathetic, profound truth of the entire ordeal. He was actually going to walk through those heavy oak courtroom doors, fully believing he was still smart enough to talk his way out of the apocalypse, entirely unaware that the sky was already falling directly toward his head. The heavy mahogany doors of the family court sealed shut behind us at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Inside, the air was heavily conditioned and smelled faintly of floor wax and stale tension. Julian sat at the respondent's table, flanked by his incredibly expensive, silver-haired defense attorney. The lawyer began his opening statement with a smooth, practiced cadence. He painted a highly sympathetic portrait of a corporate executive crumbling under the unimaginable weight of sudden severe domestic pressure. He utilized soft, harmless vocabulary. He called the abandonment a necessary therapeutic pause. He referred to the financial starvation as an unfortunate logistical oversight caused by acute mental exhaustion. He spoke of his client's deep need for a temporary retreat to heal his fragile nervous system so he could return as a fully capable father. Elena Ward did not object. She let the silver-haired man spin his delicate, harmless web for a full 15 minutes. When it was her turn to address the judge, she did not match his theatrical volume or his emotional appeals. She simply unclasped her thick leather briefcase and began handing over heavily indexed, certified digital records. She systematically dismantled the defense's entire psychological narrative using nothing but hard chronological facts. Elena introduced Naomi's color-coded master spreadsheet into the official court record. She directed the judge's attention to specific, paired dates. On the exact same Tuesday that I was forced to use my new freelance income to pay a past-due electric bill of $142 just to keep the lights on in the nursery. Julian had swiped his hidden credit card for a $350 hot stone massage at a high-desert spa. During the exact week that I was pleading with billing departments over $200 out-of-pocket pediatric appointments for 2 premature infants, Julian authorized a $4,000 wire transfer for a luxury villa rental. On the very afternoon I was standing in a pharmacy aisle counting loose change to buy discounted formula, he was uploading a photograph of a $90 glass of vintage wine with a caption celebrating his newfound spiritual freedom. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience spotting domestic charlatans, stopped taking notes and peered over her reading glasses directly at Julian. But Elena was just warming up. She moved swiftly past the gross moral failures and plunged straight into the actionable corporate fraud. She laid out the time-stamped digital logs, proving Julian had actively downgraded the family health insurance to an employee-only tier while I was literally still recovering in a hospital bed. She presented the forged internal human resources document that permanently diverted my fully earned corporate maternity pay into his secret shell company. She submitted the fraudulent social media posts where he used unauthorized photographs of the neonatal intensive care unit to actively solicit thousands of dollars in illicit online donations under completely false pretenses. The courtroom grew intensely, suffocatingly quiet. Julian's lawyer attempted to interject, stammering something about marital misunderstandings and administrative confusion, but he had absolutely zero paper to back up his hollow words. Every single document Elena produced was a heavy, iron nail driven directly into the coffin of their vicarious burnout defense. This was not a sudden, tragic mental health crisis. This was a highly calculated, meticulously orchestrated financial assassination. Then, Elena delivered the fatal, unexpected blow. She introduced a sworn preliminary statement from the legal representative of the commercial lender handling our home equity line of credit. The bank officially confirmed that the $85,000 loan application contained a forged electronic signature and was currently under active investigation for gross document fraud. Furthermore, Elena submitted a certified overnight letter she had received just 12 hours prior from the chief compliance officer at Crown Meridian Finance. Based on the evidence of falsified income verification and the misuse of secure internal networks, Crown Meridian had officially suspended Julian Hayes without pay, pending a comprehensive internal audit of his corporate activities. I sat perfectly still and watched the absolute destruction of my husband. For the very first time since I met him, his face completely collapsed. The arrogant, sun-tanned smugness he had carried into the room melted away, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed terror of a man who suddenly realizes he is trapped inside a burning building with absolutely no exits. He looked frantically at his highly paid lawyer, but the silver-haired man was just staring down at his legal pad, actively calculating how to distance himself from a client who was about to face federal fraud charges. Julian's world was rapidly shrinking, every single door slamming shut in his face all at once. The judge did not need to deliberate for long. She struck her wooden gavel and issued her ruling with a sharp, unforgiving tone. She granted me immediate, exclusive temporary legal and physical custody of both Ivy and June. She awarded me exclusive use and possession of our marital home, ordering Julian to completely vacate the premises by 5 o'clock that evening. She ordered maximum temporary child and spousal support, calculated against his previous, unadjusted executive salary, and mandated that he pay 75% of my accumulating legal fees. Most chillingly for Julian, she read into the official court record that she found highly credible evidence of severe financial misconduct and intentional document fraud, stating that she was holding the matter open for further judicial review and potential referral to outside investigative agencies. The hearing was adjourned. The heavy legal machinery had done its job. We walked out into the brightly lit marble hallway of the courthouse. Julian was a few paces behind me, his tie loosened, his expensive suit suddenly looking a size too big. Before he could even catch his breath to attempt another pathetic, whispered negotiation, his smartphone chimed loudly in the echoing corridor. He pulled the device from his pocket. I did not need to see the screen to know exactly what was happening. I watched his shoulders slump forward. He had just received the formal, company-wide email confirming his immediate suspension from Crown Meridian Finance. A second chime followed instantly. That would be the automated alert from the commercial lender, formally notifying him that his massive equity loan was permanently frozen and his file had been transferred to their internal anti-fraud division. His total collapse did not happen in a loud, cinematic explosion. It happened quietly, like heavy wooden floors snapping and giving way beneath his polished shoes, one level at a time. In the span of a single morning, he had lost absolute control of his family. He had lost his carefully curated, public facade of being a devoted, suffering father. He had lost his prestigious, high-paying corporate standing. Most devastatingly of all, he had completely lost the heroic, misunderstood narrative he had so desperately tried to sell to the world. I stood near the heavy glass exit doors and looked back at him one final time. He was leaning heavily against the cold marble wall, staring blankly at his phone, completely utterly ruined. I did not smile in triumph. I did not walk over to mock his devastating fall from grace. I simply did not care enough about him anymore to offer him a reaction. I turned around and walked out into the bright morning sunshine with my spine perfectly straight. My phone was full of upcoming pediatric appointments for my thriving, healthy daughters. My wallet contained money I had earned with my own 2 hands. I breathed in the fresh Virginia air and settled into a profound, incredibly quiet truth. The man who had callously walked out my front door to supposedly find himself had ultimately found nothing but his own devastating invoices, and now he was going to spend the rest of his life paying them. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on this journey. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, leave a like, and do not forget to support the channel by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.